Well, good morning, church. Nothing like saying, hey, let's introduce you, and also, would you like to preach? So you're going to get to know me a little bit this morning. I am really excited to get to know this family over the course of the next few months, and more than a few months, several months, many months. So hopefully I'll have time to get to know you here in the church and maybe in a coffee shop or at your residence. I'd really mean that. I really would love to get to know you, and I'm eager to be part of this family. I hope in the meantime that you might get to know my family a little bit. You heard Rick mention that we do have 4 kids. We live in Bartlett, which is just north of here. We have a picture, I think, of my fam. I think they are some of the best people on the planet. 2 of them are here with me today, and 2 of them are actually at a church retreat as we speak. So we're praying that they encounter God, even in this moment. I remember some very specific things about my kids that came to mind as I was looking at Psalm 27 in preparation for today. And one of those things were when I discovered my children's fears. Like sometimes those manifest pretty early. When Natalie, who is our oldest and our daughter, was just a year old, my husband and I took her with us on a trip to Russia. We were in Russia for 3 weeks, and during that time, we visited a family, and the family had a pet bird. And upon releasing the bird around the apartment that they were living in, my daughter had a complete and total freak out over the bird. And we had never seen her around a bird before, but we learned very quickly by her actions that she did not like the bird. She was, wailing and clinging. She had the death grip, around my neck. Like she just would not let go, clinging to mom. I remember too, when we discovered our youngest, Tyson, had a fear of anything that is like a mascot costume. So Chuck E. Cheese was out forever. Anytime we would go to a football game or a zoo or anything like that, if there was somebody in costume, certainly we knew that Tyson would run away and cling to mom or dad, just in terror, pure sheer terror. And things that were meant to be joyous for little kids were actually terrifying for him. In all of these cases, we noticed an instinct in our kids, and it was simple. You turn from what you're afraid of, and you run and cling to the nearest mom or dad. It's just instinct. We didn't have to teach them that. But David's psalm paints a very similar picture for us this morning in Psalm 27 that we heard read. David knew instinctually to turn from the things that would bring him fear and to run to his God instead and cling. I hope that we can really sink in, that will sink in for us this morning, because that sounds, not only instinctual, but rather churchy, for Christians to say, of course, we turn from the things that we fear and we run to God and we cling to him and we trust him. And that sounds like a thing that Christians do, but the reality is, I know for me, that is not always my behavior when I'm faced with the things that I'm afraid of. Now, David really had real reason to fear. I mean, he was not talking about Chuck E. Cheese or a pet bird in this passage. He mentions evildoers and adversaries and foes, an army that is encamped against him, a war that might be rising up against him. These are real dangers in his life he's surrounded by. He has not only a sense that there are people against him, but there is danger. Life is at risk for David, for his throne, for the whole nation of Israel, for his family. Everything is at risk for David. He had reason to fear. If you think about the stories in David's life, he knew real danger in his life. He had reason to fear. But he says in verse 3, even though the adversaries and the foes and the evildoers, there's war rising up, all around me is pressure and danger. It looks like it's about to be checkmate. But he says, yet, in verse 3, I will be confident. Now, why does he say, I'm actually not going to be afraid? And instead, I will be confident. Why would he say that? I believe that the things he's talking about actually trigger real memories he has of God showing up and being faithful when there has been imminent danger for him. We think about the stories we know about David's life. We know that he came on the scene when Goliath was taunting the whole nation of Israel and threatening the downfall of the nation with a whole Philistine army behind him. And everyone in Israel was terrified. And David said he would not be afraid because he knew the battle belonged to whom? To him? No, to the Israelite army? No, the battle belonged to God. And God showed up that day, didn't he? David remembers that. David remembers when he was told he was going to be king, and yet Saul was still king. And Saul knew his throne was coming to an end and that David was threatening his throne. And so Saul set out to end David's life. And he physically chased him through the wilderness, through the high places, through the rocks and the mountains. He physically chased him down to kill him. And what happened to David? God showed up for him. God came through. The Philistine army is pressing against him, and what happens? God does miracles that are unexplainable, except that God showed up when David should have been afraid. We even think that at this point he's probably failed in his kingship with his adultery with Bathsheba and the way he murdered Bathsheba's husband to cover it up. David has failed massively. And guess what? God shows himself to be forgiving and loving and the God who pursues him and brings restoration. You see, David has confidence in the midst of genuine, real, legitimate fears because he remembers that God is good, that God is always, ever, only loving to him, and God is faithful. David remembers, and so he is confident. Now, what has this faithfulness of God looked like for David? We see some of that here in the passage as well. As I was looking at this passage, I noticed that David talked over and over about God being a stronghold for him. But not only did he call him a stronghold, he mentioned 6 different types of shelter that God has been for him as he remembers. He calls him a stronghold, but he also calls him a house. He calls him a temple, a shelter, a tent, a rock. David says he is a shelter of safety, of strong, like a strong, safe place, but also a place where God is going to show up and he will encounter him. This made me think about when I was a kid. Anybody grew up in the 70s or 80s, or maybe you were raising kids in that era? When I was young, I just revealed to you my age, so okay. So now you can do some math, but when I was little, I would walk to grade school. And in my neighborhood, I don't know, I mean, when you're little, everything seems enormous. So like in my estimation, it was probably like 20 blocks, but it probably really was only maybe 5. Okay, let's say it was 5 blocks to walk to school. And when I was in kindergarten and first grade and second grade, little kid, my mom would send me out the door, and I would walk to school with my little lunchbox and my backpack, and sometimes a friend and sometimes not. Now, today, we live across the street from a school, and I see parents who live a block away dropping their children off by car. And I tend to go to that, like, when I was little, we walked to school. I'm there in that point. But anyway, we would walk to school. But the one thing I remember was that even though I was a little, vulnerable, tiny kid, sometimes by myself, on my way to school, no adult watching me, and I would walk by my little self down the sidewalk, I wasn't afraid. And one of the reasons is because of these windows along the way. Does anyone recognize these? This was like a thing in the 70s. Okay, who recognizes these? Okay, there were blue stars in some of the houses along the way to school. And there was a neighborhood program that taught the children that if you are ever afraid, if you are ever in danger or alone, if you can't get into your house, if you're locked out, if you feel unsafe, like someone, stranger danger is happening, you can look for a house with a blue star. And even though you don't know what's inside, you can guarantee that you'll be safe there. We had this blue star system. And so even though I was completely vulnerable to any dangers befalling a young 6-year-old girl on her way to school with her little metal lunchbox, I was not afraid because I knew there was a safe house. Actually, there were lots of them along the way. And if anything caused me to be afraid, I could run to the safe house. David is saying God is his blue star system. God is his safe house. He knows and he remembers that every time I have had reason to fear, I can run to God and he will be good and he will be faithful and he will show up for me. Now, it may not always be in the way we expected. And it doesn't mean that things aren't going to be hard or scary. But he is confident that God is his stronghold. I have some pictures of what these words may have meant to David. As a stronghold, we picture fortified walls, like a castle wall. Nothing is getting over that wall. Nothing is getting in. In fact, God says, I love you and I will be a stronghold for you when there is real things to be afraid of. One of the other images he mentions is a tent. Now, David was not talking about like camping at Starved Rock kind of tent. He was most likely referring to the fact that at this point in time, there was no structural temple built yet. There was no church, there was no Batavia Covenant church building situation, and instead they had what they called the tabernacle or the tent of meeting, which is what you would see up on the right-hand corner. Here's the thing about the tent. There are very specific rules about who could go in the tent. Moses could go in the tent. Joshua went in the tent. The priests could go in the tent. That was pretty much it. Because inside the tent was the Holy of Holies, where God's very presence would reside. There were clear rules that if you violated the rules, you were risking your life because of what the inside of that tent represented, the very presence of God. But what is this in this passage? David says that God is going to conceal me under the cover of his tent? Wait a minute, David gets to go in the tent? David understands the miraculous love of God. After he has failed with Bathsheba, after he has failed by killing her husband, David understands that this is a God who makes those of us, all of us, who have failed him, who are marked by our sin and our failure and our rejection of him and our selfishness, who have no business being in that tent. And he cleans us, and he welcomes us, and he loves us, and he wants us in his presence. David says, my God is not just a stronghold of safety. My God is a God, when I am afraid, who invites me into the tent with him. How undeserved that is. It should blow our minds that David says, when I am afraid, not only can I run into the stronghold of God, I can run into the tent of God and be in his very presence. The God of the universe, the holy of holiest gods, we can be in his presence when we're afraid, which should right-size our fears immediately, shouldn't it, if we're allowed into the tent? And the other thing he mentions in verse 5 that God will set him high on a rock. Now, at first glance, it sounds like maybe David understands rock climbing, or, maybe I was just in California and I saw, we had gone up the side of a mountain on a tram, and there were all these people who had these giant, backpacky things that looked like huge mattresses. And I said to my son, do you think they were sleeping out here? Do you think it turns into a tent? What are those? And I asked one of the guys on the tram on the way down, I said, what are those giant mattress things you guys carry around? And he said, oh, they're crash pads because we're rock climbers. And I thought, is David a rock climber? Is he one of those guys? Is that what he's talking about? He sets him high on a rock and, David's, scaling the side. I don't think that's what he's referring to. Because remember, David is remembering times when God has been good to him and faithful to him. One of those times was when Saul was pursuing his life. Saul was out to kill him. Imminent danger was following David everywhere he went. And he couldn't even live in a real city. And during one of those periods, he hid out in the cave of Adullam. And in several places, it's called the Rock of David. David remembers being in the cave with Saul in the very moments he could have died, and God was good to him. David was facing imminent danger in that cave, in that rock. And he knew God to be good to him there. And so he says, he's going to set me high on a rock. I remember the time I was living in a rock, and God came through. You see, David is right-sizing his fears in the presence of who he knows God to be. His rock is not only a firm place that God has given him to stand, but a place where he knows the safety and the presence of the God who loves him. Now, this sounds like a really great Bible story. But the reality is we have things we fear daily, weekly, annually, in seasons of our life that feel ominous. And I don't know what that is for you. Maybe that's finances. Maybe that's one of the secrets you're holding, is that on the outside it looks like we're doing fine, but if anyone really knew, we are terrified about our finances. Maybe it's your future. Are you in midlife and you're not really sure what's happening with your career? Are you towards the end of your life and the future is terrifying to you? Maybe you're young and you don't know, you're making decisions about your future, and that feels terrifyingly overwhelming to make those big choices. Maybe it's in relationships. Do you fear abandonment? Do you fear rejection? Are you worried the people who say they're there for you are not really going to be there for you? Do you feel failure in your work, in your parenting? Do you fear illness? Some of you maybe are carrying terminal illnesses now or have loved ones who are. Is that your fear? Is it the fear of not being enough for people? Is it the bigger fears of political instability or things happening in the world? There is no chance that you could leave today and saying, no, I have exactly nothing to fear. If that's you, I'd like to talk to you after the service to figure out where you're living and who you live with. We have things we fear, and those fears can grow to be ominous and terrifying. They can take over our thought life. They can keep us awake at night. They can destroy our relationships. Maybe you have fears about your own family, maybe broken relationships that you fear never will be healed. Maybe in light of what we heard today about the decisions made in our own church family, we grieve what happened and we fear what is going to happen to the covenant church. Even David knew those fears. You know, it was Absalom, his own son, who was after his life. And yet, when Absalom died, he wept. David gets the fears of a divided family, whether that's our relational family or our church family. What is it for you? What is it for you? And yet, what is your instinct as you think about those things? Do you stay like a magnet connected to those fears? Do you dwell on them? Do you let them rule you? Do you let them have voices in your decision making? Or is your instinct to run to the shelter of God and sit in his presence? Is your instinct to build your own shelter? Sometimes we do that. We build a shelter of worry. We build a shelter of despair or of control. Maybe if I just control the situation. We build a shelter of isolation. We remove ourselves and we make sure no one really knows what's going on. Or we try to retaliate, maybe with our words or with our actions. Sometimes we try to build our own shelters. And in the process, we still stay connected to these ominous fears. In the year 2008, I went through a full 3 years of difficult thing after difficult thing. I felt like every single time we would get our feet under us, someone would knock the legs right back out under us. It began in the spring of 2008. My husband and I were living in DeKalb, working at Northern Illinois University, and in February of that year, we had a campus shooting, if any of you remember that. We were working closely with the students, and it felt like we were violated in our own living room. The auditorium where that shooting happened was the same auditorium where our students would worship. And I could picture every seat and every screw and every door when that happened. And even though I wasn't in the room, I felt so scared that this would happen in my backyard. Just a few months later, we were on vacation, and my son, one of my sons at the time, was about 6 years old. We had left our kids with friends, and he fell 35 feet out of a tree while we were gone, and was airlifted from DeKalb to Rockford. He had broken both arms, he had internal injuries, and we were out of the country when it happened. And I thought, I can't leave my kids alone. Something bad might happen. I mean, I went into full-on parental panic after that. A few months later, an InterVarsity colleague of mine in Wisconsin was hit by a bus, and 2 weeks later, he died. My great-aunt passed away in the same month. A few months after that, my grandmother fell. She had a stroke, and within 2 weeks, she passed away. And a few months after that, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. In the meantime, we were trying to sell our house, and we went through 4 broken contracts over the course of 3 years. 3 years. And every single time, my response was not to run to God. My response was not, oh, these things are terrifying, and it feels like they're in control of my life, and in the world of our finances and not being able to sell our house, in the world of my job and taking care of the students, in the world of our safety, in the world of my parenting and protecting my kids, I felt like fear was consuming me. And I tried to respond with control. I isolated myself from people, and I grew very depressed, and despair really set in. And then shame, because I was a full-time, Christian worker who should really understand how to do this with God, right? But I didn't. And it wasn't until some wonderful people, a counselor and a trusted Christian mentor came around me and said, Michelle, let's figure out how to run to God in this. Let's figure out how God wants to interact with you in times of fear and pain. And what I discovered is what David wrote, that he is beautiful and he tastes good. And God is always, ever, only ready to love us if we run into his shelter. I found that when I was afraid and in pain, that there were things I tasted of God that I probably never would have otherwise. But I didn't taste them trying to create my own shelters. I only tasted them when I intentionally ran to him. Now, what does that look like? Running to God. Well, I think a couple of things we see in this passage. One, we've talked about already. Remember. God's already been pursuing you and active in your life. There are times when he has come through for you, and usually the problem is we just don't remember. I realized this was a problem for me. And so for a while in our family, we decided to start a basket of remembrance. In the Old Testament, there's a story about how the Israelites would create an altar or rocks. They would leave rocks in a place where they wanted to remember something God had done for them. And so I bought rocks. I bought little river rocks. And I invited our family, whenever you notice God showing up for you, write it on a rock. We're going to put it in this basket. And, honestly, I don't even know what half of these things mean. It's not important. The person who wrote it knows what it means. But there are times when I just really need to remember that God has shown up for us. And so I go to this basket and I read what's been written on these rocks and I say, oh yeah, he did do that for us. Oh, I remember that now. And, oh yeah, I remember when this happened for my daughter. And these rocks have been a place of remembrance for us. Do you need to start your own basket? Really, run to Hobby Lobby, get yourself some river rocks. It's not hard. What are you going to do to remember? Second thing is to rest. David talked about what it was like to be in the house of God. And there was rest there for him. He would just sit. He just wants to live there and dwell there and sit in the presence of God in his house and behold his beauty. Sometimes the things what keeps me from being with God is, this sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud, but I'm hoping someone relates to this. I feel like I don't really know what to say. I I'm not sure what to say, and maybe prayer feels a little laborious, and maybe I'll get distracted or bored, and so I just don't. And one of the things God has been inviting me into is prayer that doesn't require words. Some people call it centering prayer or using images in prayer, but it really just means sitting with God and not having to say anything. You know, he says he already knows what's on our heart. Sometimes all I do is I picture the thing I'm afraid of or the person I'm grieving for, and I just picture setting it at his feet, and then I just sit there with him. And sometimes I walk away feeling like I feel like he's whispered to me, and sometimes not. But just resting in his presence helps to right-size our fears. And then lastly, releasing. Sometimes we have been hanging on to what we're afraid of, and we keep going to God and asking him to fix it, and yet we hang on. We keep hanging on. We keep maybe building our shelter of control or retaliation or of whatever it is, and we hang on to that thing. Well, I'm afraid about our finances, and so I am just going to be freaked out all the time. I'm going to talk about money all the time. I'm going to be worried all the time. I'm going to be looking for extra jobs. I'm going to be and I hang on to it. And I might go to God and talk to him about it, but I hang on. And so this morning, I want us to practice a prayer of release together. So if you want to stand to your feet, we're going to practice this morning. And I just invite you to stand and just put your hands out like this and close your eyes. And as you picture something that causes you fear or pain, or it just feels a little ominous to you right now, I want you to grip it. Close your fists as though you're holding it. And I'm going to give you just a minute to talk to God about that thing. What is it? What about it makes you afraid? What about it concerns you? How does it make you feel? Talk to him about that. And when you're ready, I want you to tell God who you know he has been for you. And as you do, I want you to open your hands and release what feels scary to you to him. Friends, when fear threatens, may you seek God's shelter. And may you be confident to say, as David did, that he will hide me in his shelter. He will conceal me in his tent, and he will set me high on a rock. Amen.